Today's gospel lesson is from Mark 5, 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched my clothes?' or 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, and he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Through these words our God is still speaking.
Thanks be to our still speaking God. Good morning.
Morning.
I'm feeling a lot better, so sit back, relax, and hope pray your ovens turn down. Make up for a lost time. How many of you have ever received flowers, a card, a phone call, or maybe someone drop off a meal, or just giving you a hug or a pat on the back, or maybe you just held your hand for a moment and never expected it? Have you ever had that?
Yeah.
Let me see. All of us have. If you have, whether you know it or not, you've been touched by God. You may not realize it, but that's what's happening. For God felt your suffering, and through that person, sent by the Spirit, you felt the compassion He had for you in that moment. There's two kinds of touch. The first being physical touch. So often when Jesus wanted to transmit His power of love, He physically touched people, like the man born blind and the children in Jerusalem being two examples. An embrace, a kiss, an arm on the shoulder, a pat on the back. All of these are ways of expressing a love which goes beyond words. It's lamentable. I'm going to have competition back there with friends.
Sorry.
It's lamentable that we're so paranoid in this subject in America. We have grown touchy about touching. In other words, in other parts of the world, they don't seem to have this hang-up. To me, the guidelines that we can use for this is from the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. You all know it. Familiar verses that read from, "There is a time to live and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which planted, a time for peace and a time for war, a time to touch and a time to refrain from touching." The sage person will appreciate the difference. Reverend Brett Blair shared in the seminary, one of his professors was a teaching psychologist, who said to class one day, "No minister will ever get close to a person who he is unwilling to physically touch. If you're not willing to touch a homeless person, an alcoholic, or a terribly dirty person, you physiologically are unwilling to minister to them. Interesting statement. We have before us this morning two stories. The story of a sick woman with a 12-year-old hemorrhage, the story of a 12-year-old girl who's dying. The story are integrated by one thing, the compassionate healing of Jesus. Our story starts with Jairus, synagogue leader, approaching Jesus with a request to come and heal his sick daughter. And on his way to the home of Jairus, he is met by a woman who's been sick and bleeding for 12 years. In terms of modern medicine, she probably needed a hysterectomy. But Jesus gave her more. He gave her a compassionate healing. The woman approached Jesus with a theology that was limited, distorted, and based on misconceptions. She thought that by touching Jesus' garment, she'd be healed. This is called magic. So what's going on in this story? Now, Jesus and his disciples had recrossed the Sea of Galilee, possibly landed at Capernaum. As usual, another large crowd gathered around him. Out of that crowd emerges another petitioner. This is a very influential member of a community, one of the rulers of the synagogue. Matthew 9:18 called him a ruler, one of the 7 community leaders in the average town. And a synagogue patron of the synagogue who was given charge over both the physical building, including finances, and the order of worship. In other words, he was pretty powerful. He could choose who would read Scripture and who would give a homily. And for such a VIP to fall at Jesus' feet shows both his plight and his regard for Jesus. Something that's interesting, too, is that this is an unusual to name a person in a healing miracle. You know, none other healing miracles is a person named. It's a blind man, it's a child, it's a leper. There's no name. Here's the person's name. So Jairus, the elected ruler of the local synagogue, approaches Christ and drops to his knees, begging him to come help save his 12-year-old daughter who's dying. The name Jairus, maybe either he awakens or sees. Either would be appropriate, as just the fact that his name shows he has great status. And something else you should know is that many of the synagogue rulers had close ties to the Pharisees. It is likely, therefore, that some of the synagogue rulers have been pressured not to support Jesus. So for Jairus to bow before Jesus was a significant, perhaps daring act of respect and worship. When we read the Scripture, we're never told what type of disease the little girl had. But obviously it's quite serious and she's dying. And Jairus is at the end of his rope and clearly is praying that Jesus can heal the terrible disease in his daughter. Jesus touched a leper, healed him, and many ill people had touched Jesus to be healed. So Jairus asked Jesus to put his hands on the girl, believing that this could heal her. So within this story of Jesus, the great physician is on his way to take care of an emergency house call for Jairus. Then there's an interruption that occurs. Interruptions are always frustrating. I may be on my way to take care of a situation with one resident at Trinity, and another stops me and has an urgent problem that they need to take care of. So it's one of those things where you take care of the one first, then you go to the next. Because interruptions are a part of our job, part of our life. Few of us would consider the possibility of God being interrupted, but this is precisely the case in our passage today from Mark. He's on his way to heal a young girl on the verge of death when he's interrupted by a woman who is also in desperate need of help. Those of us who have not thought very deeply on the theological implications of divine interventions and interruptions, this passage invites us to engage in such a novel and noble enterprise. In this throng was one woman who was there for quite a different reason. We're told that for 12 years she's been suffering from a bleeding hemorrhage. Some modern scholars have theorized that this was a bleeding cancer. In this case, of course, she was beyond medical help. Mark and Matthew tell us that she'd always been to all the doctors. And she'd only gotten worse. Besides that, they'd taken all her money, as Steve read for us. Interesting, Luke, who's a physician himself, tells the story well, but he could not bring himself to tell that side of the story. Called professional pride, but he's not about to say that she was taken for all her money by a long string of doctors. This woman suffered as much from her cures as she did from her case of bleeding. From various sources, we're informed that as a nature, some of the things that were used for cures. Brace yourself. Heidi's natural history reveals that generally, low condition of medical science in the world at that time that caused some problems. Physicians were accustomed to prescribing doses of curious concoctions made from ashes of burnt wolf's skull, stag's horns, head of mice. Don't that throw you? The eyes of crabs, owl's brains, the livers of frogs and other elements. For dysentery, powdered horse's teeth was administered. And you'll love this one. For a common head cold, the cure was kissing a mule's nose. Don't that just make you feel good about your doctor? From Jewish writings such as the Talmud, we learn some of these cures. One remedy consisted of drinking a goblet of wine containing a powder compound from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses. Another treatment consisted of a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine administered with the summons, "Arise out of your flow of blood." Other physicians prescribed shock, or the carrying of the ashes of an ostrich egg in certain cloth. Thank God we've advanced in medicine. And to add insult to injury, literally, this woman was also subjected to tremendous social pressures. The nature of this woman's illness fell into the stipulation of Leviticus 15, whereby she would have to pronounce herself unclean. And as such, she was an outcast for 12 years. She could not take part in religious observances. She could not have any public contact without defiling those who she would touch. And apparently, she was also forced to be separated from her husband. Last of all, this pathetic woman lost all her financial resources. And Mark tells us she had spent all of her money on doctor bills with no relief. Indeed, with added affliction. And in those days, there was no such thing as malpractice suits. According to Levitical law, a woman who was bleeding was considered unclean under law. She could touch no one. There are many ancient taboos. She didn't want to have to go through the process of telling the disciples what her problem was. She wanted the doctor, not a nurse. So thus, she devised a plan. Having heard the stories of Jesus' power, she declared, "If I touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed." Well, you might smile and say, well, that's kind of innocent and naive. But she reached out from the crowd and touched the garment of Jesus. Immediately, he stopped, bolted upright. He said, "Who touched me?" The disciples were kind of taken aback with this. Was some kind of a rhetorical question, who touched you? Well, Master, look around. Everybody's touching you. The New English Version quotes their words as being, what is the purpose in asking? Jesus replied one of the most mysterious lines in the Bible. He said, "I felt power flow from me." This woman desperately wanted Jesus to heal her, but she knew that her bleeding would cause Jesus to become unclean under Jewish law if she touched him. So our passage says she reached out by faith and was healed. Can you begin to feel this woman and imagine all the suffering she's gone through for 12 long years of her life? Sometimes we may feel that our problems will keep us from God. But He's always ready to help us. We should never feel or allow our fear to keep us from approaching Him. You notice that even though Jesus was on a serious emergency call, so to speak, He still took time to stop and address the woman who touched Him, calling her out before she could disappear into the crowd. The miracle is felt immediately by both the woman and Jesus. Not only does the bleeding cease, but she also feels free from her suffering. It would be hard to fathom how much relief that would be to this woman, physically and psychologically. It was undoubtedly a physical sensation of wellness and the lifting of a terrible burden that she lived under so long. Jesus feels divine power transferring from Him to the woman. And only here in the miracle stories is such a thing explained. His healing power was a physical thing. And He felt some of it leave Him. And He wasn't angry. He didn't get angry because she touched Him. He knew she had touched Him. But He stopped and asked who had done it in order to teach her something about faith. See, for Jesus, miracle must lead to meeting. And Jesus' tender response to her after this meeting, daughter, your faith has healed you. Although this woman was healed when she touched Him, Jesus said to her, faith caused the cure. Genuine faith, involves action. Faith isn't put into action, is not faith at all. Christ showed her absolute compassion in this scene. And then Jesus continues on to His original mission to Jairus' house. Jesus bids Jairus to demonstrate the same trust that the hemorrhaging woman demonstrated. After arriving at his house, Christ only allows the 3 disciples and the parents to enter with Him. He refers to the girl as sleeping. The professional mourners immediately express scorn for these words, and Jesus orders them out. And then Jesus gives the command, Talitha kum, in Aramaic, which means little girl, or literally little lamb, arise. Immediately Mark reports the girl arises and amazes all present, walks around, and Jesus says, feed her. Mark sandwiched these 2 stories together for a purpose. He wants to show us that Jairus, a man of reputation and respect, must learn the meaning of faith for an unnamed woman whose only identification is her shame. If he can trust Jesus, as a woman trusted Jesus, he need not fear. Faith means trusting in Jesus when all human hopes have been exhausted. Jairus' crisis made him feel confused, afraid, and without hope. And Jesus' words to him in the midst of crisis speaks to us as well. Don't be afraid. Just believe. In Jesus' mind, there is both hope and promise. So next time you feel hopeless and afraid, look at your problem from Jesus' point of view. He's the source of all hope and promise. See, Jesus not only demonstrated great power, but He also showed tremendous compassion for both. Jesus' power over nature, evil, spirit, and death was motivated by compassion. For a demon-possessed man who lived among tombs, for a diseased woman, and for the family of a dead girl. Perhaps have they considered such people unclean. Polite society avoided them. But Jesus reached out and helped anyone in need. Both woman and Jairus received absolute compassion from Jesus. Compassion is always a surprise because we don't often experience that in our world today, do we? Think about what's going on in the news. Compassion is so rare that when it comes, we're shocked. Compassion literally means coming with passion. Passion's context has nothing to do with lust or a hot temper. It doesn't mean that passion is suffering with someone. Compassion is not pity. Pity lets us stay at a distance. Pity can be condescending. Compassion does not mean sympathy. Sympathy comes from someone superior to someone who is inferior. Compassion is not charity. Charity only allows a person to stay in a position of power over a poor person. Compassion, a compassionate person, means standing in another's shoes. You ever heard the expression, walk in their shoes a mile? Compassion means caring. Genuine caring. Going out to a person, entering into his or her suffering. Jesus, the busiest man in the world, with the ways and means of the kingdom of God in his mind, concerned about people's negative or shallow sin of his teaching, the burden of hundreds of people weighing heavily on his heart, and aware of what was necessary in his suffering and death in the future, is touched by the woman who touched him. That's caring. To have compassion means to care. Care comes from the word terra. Terra means to lament. Henry Newman writes, what does it mean to care? Let me start by saying that the word care has become a very ambivalent word. When someone says, I will take care of him, it's more likely an announcement of an impending attack than a rather tender compassion. Real care is not ambiguous. Real care excludes indifference, as in, I don't care. It's the opposite of apathy. To care means to suffer with another person. That's what the woman with the bad theology saw. Jesus cared. Jesus entered her suffering. He communed with her. Newton puts it this way. To care means, first of all, to empty our own cup and to allow the others to come close to us. It means to take away the many barriers which prevent us from entering into communion with one another. You know, these two stories always bring a certain hymn to mind when I read them. A hymn that talks about how Jesus touches us. I ask you to sing his hymn because it's so powerful. I also ask if you felt his touch to really sing out. And you just remain seated and sing. I know you all know. it in his face. You could see it in his eyes. She saw that he really cared. And she took a chance because of what she saw. She saw Jesus came with passion for the needy. Who touched me? Jesus asked. The slight touch of his robe in the midst of the pushing, the shoving, the clamoring crowd did not go unnoticed. Jesus was aware of the trembling, outstretched fingers of an anonymous woman touching the hem of his garment. We are encouraged to believe that God is like that. We are encouraged in this story to come just as we are, bad theology and all. Give God all of your problems. God will begin with us wherever we are. If we'll just come and trust Him as much as we can. The biblical corrective of this story is that the woman had a bad theology. It's what we are just to come as we are, to be healed by a compassionate healer. Jesus' healing was more than physical cures. He touched the soul as well as the body. He felt the pain of the people. That's why verse 30 is important. At once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. In other words, when the power of God went into a person from Jesus for healing, Jesus himself was diminished. This is what coming with passion is all about. Compassion means being so deeply involved with others that you yourself are spent. And that's why Jesus was so exhausted at the end of the day. But it's all its imperfections, sins, blemishes, and warts. The church of Jesus Christ is the intended healer of the world's wounds. Christians are called to be compassionate wound healers. Perhaps there now, the Roman Catholic theologian has said this better than anyone else. The author of many books, no one speaks of Christians as wounded healers who have compassion. Compassion is born of God. It means entering into another person's problems. It means taking on the burdens of life. It means standing in another person's shoes. It's the opposite of professionalism. It is a humanizing way to deal with people. Just as bread without love can bring war instead of peace, professionalism without compassion turns forgiveness into an image. In this story, we see the compassionate face of Christ. Jesus suffered with those who suffered. He served with passion those whose need moved them to say or do things like reaching out in vulnerable ways. He compassionately greeted the young girl who came back from the dead. That compassion should give us hope for this life. So Jesus comes with passion to your situation, wherever that may be. That compassion should give you hope for the next life as well. The day will come when you experience the most pleasant reversal of all. You will wake up from death and see the compassionate face of the Lord Jesus welcoming you into heaven. You will also hear the words personally spoken to you. Young man, young woman, old man, old woman, I say to you, arise. Amen.